Hey there, IndyCar fans. This is Nathan Brown reporting to you live from the IMS Media Center. It is Monday night, May 19th, and we are kicking off an episode of the Inside Line, one that I'm very excited to dive into here with my co-host, Joey Barnes. We typically, on an episode, would kind of map out our thoughts on, say, a race weekend or a topic, and kind of see where each other is and game plan the episode, have some bullet points that we want to hit, have a little bit of a roadmap for this episode. To be very clear, Joey and I have not talked with each other really very much at all this entire weekend, particularly not much at all since the last, I'd say 28 hours or so. In what has taken place in the IndyCar bag. It is just a couple minutes after 8:15 on Monday evening. So we have gone through another incredible saga of Team Penske technical infractions, the likes of which I imagine you guys probably know a lot about. But we'll dive into the specifics here before we dish out some takes, talk about where IndyCar should go from here with all of this, and also touch on the amazing accomplishments of Robert Shwartzman and Prema Racing taking pole for the 109th Indy 500. And really a very, I would say, balanced and interesting front couple rows for this race. Now, ultimately, the best car is going to win this race, or maybe the best car in, say, the first 9 rows is probably going to win this race. I really don't know if Joseph Newgarden's going to be able to win from 32nd, but we'll get all into that more. Joey, take me through. You were watching all of this unfold from home. I've been running around, frankly, all weekend, seemingly, covering an odd number of crashes that, to me, on Sunday morning felt like the story going into qualifying, with 3 cars taking flight, getting airborne, either completely flipping over or getting sideways in the air. I'd written a story Sunday morning after Scott McLaughlin's crash, feeling like these cars getting airborne was the big story that we would be talking about coming out of qualifying. And then we have what happened on the broadcast right around about 4 o'clock as the Fox broadcast kicked off for the Fast 12. Take me through what you saw on the broadcast as things started to unfold and we started to realize that there was something afoul on these 2 Team Penske cars.
Yeah, just an absolute chaotic weekend in general, right? From Fast Friday all the way to now. But I guess to just isolate this to yesterday, and because obviously we can talk about the crashes here in a minute, but this being the precedent one is, as this was developing, and I was mostly tuning into IndyCar radio, to be honest, because I noticed that they were getting a heck of a lot more out of the story and what was going on. And it was fascinating to me that in real time, you could have cars go through tech, be pushed out onto the grid to go and participate in the Fast 12, but then you find out that they had failed tech. That's how it was described in the moment. And you're just kind of like, how do you get on track if that can happen? Like, that doesn't make sense. And if there's a questionable offense to it, then why are we pushing out anyway? And I understand maybe there's a rush because of a broadcast window, and maybe there's an order and a format and a structure that they go by for all intents and purposes. But, that's also, you look at that and there's a reason it's called inspection. It's for safety. It's primarily for safety. And then you find out, okay, everybody's getting pushed back to the back. Everybody's going back there. Power and Newgarden are effectively withdrawing, forfeiting their opportunity to go. Obviously, we know Scott McLaughlin wasn't one of those people that was allowed to go because he had crashed about 2 hours earlier in practice. But you're sitting there watching all of this unfold, and it just became a little mind-numbing, honestly, because you're like, wait, how this is this? It was also, keep in mind, I don't believe this was Fast Friday. I actually think it happened Saturday, now that I'm recollecting it. And could have swore Joseph pulled out from his 33rd
Correct.
draw spot.
Correct.
And I kind of wonder if that's for a similar thing now, honestly, like in real
So
time.
I think my understanding on that real quick, as best as I remember, is I think when you are one of those last couple spots, my understanding is like if you're going to already go several hours in, teams would rather have the freedom to decide ultimately when they want to go. If say, maybe the skies are, blue, no clouds anywhere at 1:15 when the 33rd slot is scheduled to go, but there's maybe some cloud cover coming in at 1:45. A team might not want to run at their scheduled time at 1:15 in order to have the freedom to just go exactly when they want to go when the conditions are at their best from what they can tell in their data and their weather technology. And so not going at your scheduled time when basically there's only one other car that needs to go after you before you have the freedom to go whenever you want, I think is how I best understood that. But that's kind of here nor there at this point. So continue.
Yeah. But it does raise suspicion, right? Because that's the first thing that I thought of is like, wait, they did withdraw from their 33rd spot. And just, that's me in real time thinking about that. That's not anything that I was like thinking before we jumped on, but it's to see how also things played out yesterday for Fast 12, and the fact that like later you start to see clips. Pelot is like looking over the Penske crew while they're trying to deal with the rear wing and the attenuator area. Joseph's like right behind Pelot talking to him. Pelot's obviously got an incredibly big smirk on his face watching all of this take place. And then you believe it was Jenna Fryer from the AP that was first talking about the fact that Ganassi was mentioned as the person who pointed it out. And I think in the moment, I'm over here thinking, why the hell is another team pointing out a technical violation that should have been caught in inspection? Why? And also, how blatantly obvious can you be? Like it's kind of wild to me that it's that obvious. Like there's things that you're not allowed to touch. You have all the time in the world to touch it in your garage, and you bring it out to through tech inspection, pit lane, and then you're deciding to mess with it. A blowtorch clear as day that cameras caught, and then obviously we know the end result was them being demoted or withdrawing their times and settling for 11th and 12th. I'm fascinated with just if I'm being completely blunt, it comes across as arrogant. It comes across, they don't need to. They're looked at as the sterling, team in this paddock. They're the trendsetter. They've got 20 wins in the Indy 500, which, 2023 was a little controversial because of that weird late restart on the final lap. And then you look at evidence that you were able to gather today at the museum with Joseph's car from last year. And it's just like the evidence continues to stack up. Maybe they should only be 18-time champions. But also, like, where else did this attenuator issue come into play at other racetracks last year or the year before that? I think that's where it's getting dangerous. And it's the fact that now it's the teams policing the paddock, which, in fairness, it's not necessarily a case of the inmates running asylum. Like, we're all a network here. We all hold each other accountable. But when there's supposed to be a process that is supposed to be kept and maintained and what is supposed to be viewed as of high integrity, that is all completely put into question. And, furthermore, to think about what you dug up today about the potential that last year Joseph won that race with a manipulated attenuator, let's say. The fact that was only a month after the push to pass scandal, and we were watching him give an emotional press conference at Barber Motorsports Park, and you and I are sitting there watching that together, and it's one of those that Okay. At some point, something's got to give. And then, I mean, we're going to get into a ton of other stuff related to this, but I think the one thing that I wanted to make sure that I didn't forget is that there were some pretty heavy-handed penalties levied out last year from the push-to-pass scandal. But nobody lost their job. Some lost their title. Tim Cindric was effectively removed from president of Penske as a whole and effectively given the title of president of Penske's IndyCar operation and remaining the strategist for Newgarden. This is too consistent for this not to land on somebody at this point. That's my opinion.
So I want to go back to what you're talking about there earlier, kind of about the TikTok of how this was all playing out on pit lane. There's been, there was a lot of, maybe speculation is not the right word, but I think just uncertainty and lack of clarity as to exactly how all of this started. The report you mentioned from Jenna, who writes for the Associated Press and covers motorsports and IndyCar, I believe she was the first, as you mentioned, to point out that she had been told that Chip Ganassi was confronting someone that I later learned to be Penske Corp Executive Vice President Jonathan Gibson down on pit lane, and Chip was essentially saying, "Don't make me effing say something," and commenting on the fact that Team Penske crew members were just chipping away at these cars on pit lane when, I mean, I would say even in the average Indy 500 fan knows that after you get through tech for qualifying for this race, you're only allowed to adjust tire pressures and wing angles. It's a long known thing. It's not been changed recently. It's very simple. You get through tech and your car is set up the way it's going to go, minus maybe an opportunity to change wing angles from something that you learned from a teammate that runs a couple spots before you, or a guess that your engineers make in terms of the conditions and what they think the car is capable of, and ultimately the time that you're going for and how on the edge you think you need to be to hit that. So there was some speculation that Chip was the person that actually tipped IndyCar off about this. And as this was going on in real time, I think the perception was that the initial issue was that Team Penske was trying to make these changes on pit lane, when in reality we learned from IndyCar president Doug Boles Sunday evening, and then again reiterated in his press conference where they announced the penalties Monday morning, that this seam that had been filled on the two connecting parts of the attenuator, essentially smoothing it out, theoretically helping the air flow a little bit smoother over this portion of the car, and maybe, though we don't know for certain, providing a little bit of an aerodynamic advantage that could help this car maybe go a fraction of a mile an hour faster. But this was initially spotted by IndyCar technical director Kevin Blanche and his team at the tech inspection tent ahead of qualifying. So what Doug told us was this was found initially by Kevin Blanche, who goes by Rocket, on Will's car. He thought it looked suspicious, appeared to be something that would make this spec part mean that the spec part had been tampered with or altered, and Rocket believed that this was a part that was not allowed to be so. It's very clearly laid out in the rule book on what is largely a spec car, what parts you can modify, and anything that is not listed there, Doug explained to us, is inherently not to be touched or changed or modified. Pretty simple stuff. And so in the sake of time and not getting other cars backed up, Will was allowed to roll out to pit lane and from what it sounds like to me, if Joseph's car had not been spotted with the identical change to it, it sounds like Will's car would have been allowed to qualify and maybe only been flagged to be rechecked if he'd been in the top six and had his car checked over after the event. Maybe this is something that Rocket kind of was keeping in mind and wanted to have more time to look over after the fact. And ultimately, if they deemed it to have been illegal, maybe Will would have been allowed to qualify and then been flagged after the fact. And that of course is all speculation, because that's ultimately not how this played out. Joseph's car was found to have had this same adjustment made, but Will's car was either already headed out to pit lane or was on its way there. And it was at that point Rocket felt that it was even that much more certain in his mind that this was not allowed. He conferred with race director Kyle Novak, and they both came to the conclusion from consulting the rule book that this piece was not allowed to be modified and that this was a modification. The one thing I don't understand, the thing I understand the least in this process, even now more than 24 hours later, is why Joseph Newgarden's car was still allowed to be rolled out to pit lane if they deemed that his car had failed technical inspection. Tim Cindric told us yesterday in his scrum that he gave with a group of us at the Team Penske garages that they had been notified that there was an issue with these cars, but they were initially under the belief that they might be allowed to fix the issue and then still go out. So my issue with that is the tech inspection process crammed too close to the start of on-track action to where if you were to fail pre-session technical inspection, do you have time to make any sort of fix? Now, obviously not like a massive one, but like, do you have the opportunity and the ample time to fix something before, say, getting back in line and getting rechecked and then going back out? Is there such a time crunch to this process that you basically have to roll up completely, unmistakably to code, because if there is a mistake on your car, you're not going to have a chance to fix it? I don't know. I know we see cars. I think we saw at least one. Was it maybe Elio Castro Neves on Saturday, who rolled up to tech, was found to have not passed, and he then was forced to give up his spot in line. I don't know. These are things we don't understand about this process, but what we do know is that despite Joseph having been flagged for this, for some reason, whether it was an actual communication from the IndyCar side or an incorrect belief on someone from the Team Penske side, or a little of both, I think the latter is probably the way this likely played out. You've got these two Team Penske cars making alterations bright as day with cameras on them, being broadcast on network television, making these changes, chipping away with a blowtorch, all this mess. And that's, I believe, where Chip Ganassi's ire came from. He was witnessing this going on pit lane and got super frustrated, as I imagine anyone would. I don't know, and I don't believe that this is something where, say, Chip pointed this out, that these were problematic on pit lane. That's certainly not the story that we've gotten from Doug Bowles and from Kevin Blanche yesterday, although there have been some insinuations that we learned about in today's press conference and that I've heard a little bit about, that there have been lots of folks in the paddock that in some way, shape, or form had noticed these irregularities on these Team Penske cars, at least one, if not multiples, for a little while now. And some say they have made those reports to IndyCar. and asked them to look into it. Doug Bowles, who's only been in this position for 3 months, said that no one has ever come directly to him to address those concerns. And he was not aware of anyone having done so to Rocket. So there's some folks who are saying this has been a known thing in the paddock for a while now. Why is it only getting caught now, with the insinuation that it was also going on Saturday? And you have Doug on the other hand saying we only caught this on Sunday, and that's the only set of facts that we have to go off of, and that's why we only saw, initially at least, these penalties being put towards what was going on Sunday, and these cars initially being slated to start 11th and 12th.
Yeah, and so I want to make sure we touch on this, and there's a few things that I definitely want to point out. I think one, I actually have no clue because we've been right out of the gate going ham on this. For those that, if you live under a rock and you didn't quite understand what's going on with the actual penalties that have been levied, is the fact that with these violations that have taken place from the cars of Joseph Newgarden and Will Power, they will effectively start 32nd and 33rd on the grid, respectively. And if I recall correctly, the organization was fined $100,000, which is
each entry.
Each entry was fined $100,000. So you move it from checking the savings, because Penske Entertainment is the one that oversees the IndyCar series anyway, so it's not much of an issue there. And then both teams lose their race strategist for the remainder of the month, for the remainder of the event, I should say. So just so everyone's clear on what penalties are levied, and as far as if we think that's enough or not, I guess that's where it's going to get fun. Mm-hmm. I think that there's an easy solution to limit this, but also to catch it later and to understand how to do it and how to penalize it maybe more appropriately. Because I think the real kick in the groin is the fact that when this came out this morning, when these penalties were levied out, my first thought was back to what Pato O'Ward said yesterday in the press conference of they should have been. He's like, I guarantee you that they were in violation on, paraphrasing, they're in violation on Saturday. And they should be all fighting for the last row shootout, last chance qualifier, whatever we're calling it this year. And I think he's spot on. But I'll go a step further and say, like, I firmly think Jacob Abel gets screwed in this because, one, he brought honestly the best looking race car from a livery perspective, a top-notch sponsor in Miller High Life being on board that you effectively lose from an activation standpoint now. And Dale Coyne Racing is not Team Penske, right? There's a very big disparity there. And I look at this and think, man, Jacob Abel got really screwed. And I think the way that you can fix this moving forward, impound the cars after Saturday. When you finish your 7 hours of qualifying, impound the cars. Because then if you catch anything on Sunday, you know that something was tampered with, or you know that this was in violation on Saturday. If, for whatever reason, we're all human, there could be technical overlooks through the inspection line. I firmly believe that. And so with that, I think you impound the cars after Saturday. You impound them. Maybe the only thing you allow is you put new tires on, but everything else stays the same. New tires, same air pressure. You have an official there that literally marks everything down to the letter. And whenever they go up and they're ready to shoot off after being in lane one or whatever, they go handle it. And I think impounding it after Saturday is probably the best solution to police this moving forward. But my first thought was Jacob Abel got screwed, and he's screwed because of a trend too, because this team has made a trend of pushing the limits. And look, I do believe this though, and this probably isn't going to be a popular take. If you're not cheating, you're not trying. And I believe you have to push the envelope. And I think that in some ways, Chip Ganassi Racing has forced a team like Team Penske to try to live in the gray area, if we're being honest, because the way that they are just consistently winning, this place, you could argue Scott Dixon and Alex Palou should have already won at the Indy 500 probably 2 or 3 times over in the last 5 years because of how dominant those cars are. And the only thing they have to show for it is Marcus Ericsson's win in 2022 in the last 5 years. So
and a couple poles.
Yeah, exactly. And so you look at that, this is probably the only thing that they haven't really taken control of. And it's the one thing that Penske has found a way to take control of. So I think that there's some of that we should consider to come into play. And then the last point is this: the fact that a Penske Entertainment executive like Jonathan Gibson was reportedly in this heated exchange with a team owner about something that is affiliated with Team Penske's race team is a complete bad look in general. It's as bad a look as 2 years ago when Joseph Newgarden won the Indy 500 and Penske Entertainment executive Bud Denker is sitting there clapping and happy and singing praises as if that's his race team. There needs to be a better distinction and a clearer separation of church and state, because all of that, on top of all of these issues that is facing the paddock, is part of why everyone is questioning integrity and why it looks like a full-blown dictatorship at this point.
Yeah. So I want to go through real quick from what I understand on the exchange between Chip and Jonathan on pit lane. It was described to me as a pretty much a one-way exchange, for what it's worth. I was never given the indication that, Jonathan was at all maybe pushing back. I kind of got, from how it was described to me, the picture that Jonathan was the highest ranking Penske family employee around, and Chip was right there watching all this happening. Again, like we were not aware that the 12 and the 2 cars had been, marked and deemed by the tech inspection crew to have been questionable at best and illegal at worst already at this point. And I think that was Chip essentially airing his frustrations to Jonathan as someone who was there, who has some influence, and airing his frustrations with Jonathan is not the same as going and filing a formal complaint with Kyle Novak or Rocket or someone like that. So that's kind of what I understand there. It was also interesting on this note to have seen, as I and others were headed toward the Team Penske garages, moments after the number 12 and the number 2 cars were wheeled back there and the garages were put down. It almost looked like no one was there because they wanted to keep things very quiet and secretive. Person that I crossed paths with as he was heading in the opposite direction was none other than the person you mentioned, Penske Corp president Bud Denker, who serves as the promoter of the Detroit Grand Prix, who kind of, from what we understand, I think plays a pretty sizable role in some of the organizational decisions at some of the other races that Penske Entertainment is acutely involved with, including Iowa Speedway and the doubleheader that used to be there that is now, after this year after last year, a little bit smaller of an operation, and I imagine probably somewhat similar in how Arlington is put together, et cetera, et cetera. I agree, and I remember at least specifically Bud and Jonathan and Roger back on pit lane. I think it was even last year when you had the Team Penske cars trying to lock out the front row, ultimately with that pole won by Scott McLaughlin. That was the image in my mind that I had of the Team Penske employees cheering, that kind of went viral and felt a little off, especially at a time in which this team was less than a month removed from, the team itself being less than a month removed from these penalties. You've got folks like Jonathan and Bud and ultimately Roger at some level kind of hovering back and forth over this line of, should I be cheering for the race team? Should I be, am I wearing the hat of representing the series? And when that is opaque, that's where some of these conflict of interest concerns started to become pretty clear. They popped up initially kind of in the wake of the immediate wake of the push to pass stuff, when you had questions like, why didn't IndyCar find this sooner? Are these penalties stiff enough? Is IndyCar and Penske Entertainment doing enough to investigate how long this goes back? Things like that. And then you've also got the little detour in 2023 with the Indy 500 there that Joseph won on a big race control decision that ultimately massively benefited a Team Penske driver. These are the things that, when we talk probably a little bit later and really dive into these conflict of interest concerns and where the series goes from here, these are the things that kind of just pile onto this and make it not such a cut and dry thing of, is this sanctioning body properly doling out penalties to the team, where the sanctioning body and the team are owned by the same folks? You've got this. The reason it is a perception issue is because there are outward things to view in the IndyCar ecosystem that make this an issue.
And I think this, though, on that point, I got to be delicate with how I'm trying to word this, because I want to make sure I say it the right way. I firmly believe that, like Doug Bowles said today at the presser, that he spoke to Roger Penske and Roger was devastated. I firmly believe that Roger himself is more detached than people realize. But I'll say that I think where the devastation comes from is not just because his name and his brand and now it's under scrutiny and things like that, but it's the fact that also there's people that he's effectively entrusted with this product, with the team. And it's led to situations where, and Roger very much has an order to things. He's very methodic with things. He's very organized. He likes to have control of certain things to make sure there isn't a cadence, an order and a cadence to things. And the fact that he's been hands off and kind of entrusted this process to different people, and it's led down this path. I think, and this is just my own opinion from my own optics, but I think that's part of where the devastation comes from, is that now you kind of wonder if there's a thought of misguided trust.
Mm-hmm. So let's kind of go back through. I know we've kind of just been bopping around a little bit. So we've gone through a little bit of the timeline with all of this. We've talked through how this was initially found at Tech Inspection. The things that I still frankly don't understand and think that there are changes that need to be made on, in terms of why something was flagged at Tech Inspection on Will's car and his car wasn't held back to get clarification. I feel like if you're spotting something that's a problem at Tech Inspection, then you should get an answer before that car is wheeled off. I know I've never been part of this process. I know if you notice something on every if you notice a question mark on all 12 cars and you've got a pretty tight window in which to do this and you're about ready to go on a national TV broadcast, I know that could be a little tough to, a tough needle to thread when these cars have also been on track for practice a couple hours earlier. But at some point, I don't feel like we should be wheeling cars out onto pit lane when there are when the powers that be aren't entirely certain of their legality, and they're in some ways seemingly, from the way in which Doug described it today, feeling like they're rushed and they need to just, okay, we'll deal with this later, but let's get to the next car. I really don't understand still why Joseph's car was out there when citing the issue on his car made them certain that this was a problem. And I don't understand the miscommunication there on why Team Penske employees had been told or seemed to believe that they could make this change while in pit lane, because that's kind of ultimately where this thing really blew up. And it's we kind of got Tim's side of the story first, and then we got Doug's side of the story later in the evening. And maybe some of maybe I or some of the reporters here could have done a better job of going back and making sure we didn't get those questions answered. I don't know ultimately if that's not the main part of this story, but ultimately we get to last night where a small group of us had met with Doug. He kind of ran through the facts with us, and he painted this picture that we basically now understand in terms of the timeline. He said that these cars would start 11th and 12th. Scott McLaughlin, who crashed, as you mentioned earlier in the afternoon, and didn't even make his attempt, was going to start 10th because he was, you had 3 cars that ultimately did not make attempts for various reasons. And then after that, the rulebook says that you order off of the times that they set in the previous round, which was the previous day on Saturday. So we left yesterday believing that Team Penske had swept a row, but it just wasn't the front row, which is fairly ironic given last year. And Doug had also notably said to us, again, this scrum was at 8:15 p.m. on Sunday night, that no penalties would be levied until after the race. That's typically how this would go. I think of a good example of that is when Robert Shwartzman's car at the Thermal Club was found to have not properly had its fire extinguishing system set up and connected and working when his car had its issues early on in practice one on Friday. The series did not announce any sort of penalties. Now, there weren't points penalties attached to this or grid penalties that would have affected the way in which that race on Sunday played out. But they did not announce that fine for that team and whatever else came with it. The specifics are escaping me right now, but they didn't announce any of that until a couple days after the race. Same with Colton Herta's number 26 Andretti Global entry that I believe was missing an anti-intrusion panel for some reason that I think had been updated for the rules for this year. So those are kind of an example of what Doug was referring to. Even though this is a 2-week event instead of a 3-day event, under Indy's cars rules, they had no plans to announce any sort of penalties until after the race was over with, which meant that we weren't going to get any sort of grid penalty. They were going to either hand out a fine or a suspension that would come after the race, or I don't know how you would have been able to do any sort of I guess you could have done like a points deduction if you really wanted to, and not necessarily taken away where either of the drivers finished in the race. That would have been tough if ultimately one of them went on to win the race and been a bigger problem in itself. So we get to this morning. I'm sitting in the media center. I got there a little after 9:00 this morning, and I would say around 9:45 or 10 o'clock, I start to notice, and you'll be able to picture this a little, Joey. I'm starting to see people messing with some backdrops up at the front of the room, and they've got this Indy 500 backdrop, on the stage behind the podium, and you're starting to see this IndyCar branded one get set up. And that was when the wheels started to turn. I'd come here hoping to work on a big 4,000 word Pato Award feature that I still haven't started yet. That was technically supposed to be due today. That's for a story for another time. Thinking that this was kind of all open and shut and there wouldn't be a whole lot to say about it, except maybe go and asking some drivers either before or after the full field photo shoot at 12:30, kind of what their thoughts were on how this all transpired and the oddity and weirdness of it, and what they ultimately thought about Team Penske pushing the limits on things a little bit too much. And then I see this banner go up and it's staying there, and there's a lot of movement in the front of the room. There's some people kind of huddling over in corners, talking in hushed tones. And I started, sending out some messages, trying to get some intel, and ultimately eventually found out that they would be holding a press conference just after 11 a.m. And right at 11 a.m. on the dot, comes a press release from IndyCar saying, detailing out these penalties that we learned about. And ultimately, Doug said that he left that scrum with us at about 8:30 last night. And not long after, someone who is a historian and a lifelong fan of this race and its history and its importance in the not only in the racing world but the sporting world, and kind of in culture in general, and someone who believes very strongly about how big and important this race is and what it represents in people, and the importance of doing it the right way in every single facet, that Doug started to feel like there was more to be done here. And so he said he went to, although I don't know if he necessarily really went to sleep, but mulled over things in the meantime for a couple hours, eventually got on the phone with Penske Entertainment president and CEO Mark Miles, and they pretty quickly found out that they were on the same page. They felt something else needed to be done. So they conferred with each other and some other decision makers in the Penske Entertainment world, and eventually came to these decisions that we talked about earlier, where you have these two cars dropping from 11th and 12th to 32nd and 33rd. You've got the fine, you've got the suspensions, you've got the loss of points from qualifying. Technically speaking, these cars qualified 11th and 12th, even though that's not where they will start. So those points deductions mean, I believe Joseph would have earned 2 points for qualifying 11th. Will would have earned 1 point for qualifying 12th. You earn 12 points if you start on pole, and they kind of work their way down for folks that make the fast 12. And then also the loss of pit selections. So it's a long list of things. We can go into whether we think they should have been, bumped from the race, or what we think they should have done with Jacob. But this was a pretty comprehensive list of penalties, and it was a lot of work in a short amount of time. It was a pretty big heel turn on Doug's part, from telling us what he did at 8 to not only thinking about this but having a full plan and announcing it at 11 a.m. the next morning. Really impressive work, thorough work, hard work on their end. But we get to this point where now we're faced, one of the big questions that Doug is asked in this press conference is, why ultimately did you see it fit to drop these cars down to 32nd and 33rd and not either bump them from the race entirely or allow Jacob Abel to also be part of this field and have a 34th car? What was your, as you've thought about this a little bit, and we can get into Doug's answer too, but do you ultimately feel this should have been a 34 car field for Sunday's race?
Oh man, that's a tough question. I don't know that I would have said yes to that under normal circumstances, but this is obviously not normal. What I would say was, if we know why neither of the Penske cars that were in violation were thrown out, because they're not going to be. Who owns the series, who owns the team, et cetera, to have that put against you that's a hell of a heavy hand, and you've got to talk to that guy every day.
And let's also say too, so because Doug was asked that too. Doug was, we asked Doug, why are these cars still in the field? And Doug is a lawyer. He operates off facts. He doesn't like rumors. He doesn't like, he really does a great job in everything he does, working and operating off of what he can prove beyond a shadow of a doubt. And what he said, and this is really going strictly by the rule book, is that these cars passed technical inspection on Saturday. And so all 34 cars passed tech on Saturday. And during the 6 hours and 50 minutes of qualifying action, we found out what the 30 fastest, all deemed to be legal. Whether they were legal or not is another question entirely, but deemed to be legal by the system cars were. And Team Penske was among those 30 cars. And so by putting Joseph and Will 32nd and 33rd, they still preserved having the 30 cars that had guaranteed themselves spots in the race on Saturday still in the field. And ultimately the 4 remaining cars, Marcus Armstrong, Rinus VeeKay, Marco Andretti, and Jacob Abel, dueled things out on Sunday, 4 cars for 3 spots. And those 3 cars that won out are also in the field. Now they are not starting 31st, 32nd, and 33rd, but that is something that's because of what we later learned in the decisions that IndyCar ultimately made. So I can understand in my mind where Doug is coming from there. When you look truly at the facts that we know, my issue is thinking about the unlikelihood that this change was made on
Sunday morning,
Saturday night, or Sunday morning.
Yeah, no,
that and I guess if you are someone saying that we can only go with what the rule book says and we can only go with what we know, you would have to, I guess, go in and prove through photo evidence. You'd have to go through photo evidence and kind of make some educated guesses on what you think you're seeing versus what you are actually seeing and what that feels like. And maybe a picture of one that is not in violation. And you'd have to kind of be retroactively, I guess, saying that you're, admitting that your technical inspection process missed something.
Yeah, 100%.
And there are people out there who are saying, these 2 cars should have been thrown in the LCQ immediately. I don't think that would have been appropriate at the time, given what we knew, because at the time, what we knew, and again, this is a really short window. These cars this whole process was going on at about 4:00 in the afternoon.
Oh, yeah, it was boom, boom, boom with everything.
Exactly. Yeah. That I mean, it comes down to the way in which this was set up. You've got a 3-hour TV window with Fox. The Fast 12 was scheduled to go from 4:05 to 5:05. The LCQ goes 5:15 to 6:15. And all the the tech inspection folks, guys like Rocket and otherwise, after they finish the tech inspection process, are managing the process that is taking place on track. So they don't have time in that hour, essentially, when all of this is going on and there's chaos and there's questions, and it's going to take a while, as we found out, for us to even get the timeline fully laid out by 8 p.m. that night. There's not enough time there to not only realize that these cars were illegally prepared, but to produce verifiable evidence that also said that they had this on the cars on Saturday. And that would have been the only way that you could put those cars into the LCQ, because simply failing a technical inspection, while it's not great from a qualifying process, it really just means you don't get to make your attempt. It doesn't mean that you should erase everything you did on Saturday. And that it just was, if the Fast 12 was happening at 11 a.m. and we had until, for whatever reason, if we would have had until 5 when the LCQ was going on, maybe you could have dug in although I still don't know that you would have, because we saw overnight Penske Entertainment and IndyCar was still not able to say, and I can guarantee you they were looking, because I'm sure they want to know if these cars were illegal on Saturday, and Doug was not able to come out and say this morning that those cars were illegal. So that's why I don't think you could have put the cars into the LCQ. I don't know that you could have thrown them out of the race.
So I disagree with you on this precedent, honestly.
Okay.
But so, because one, I see a scenario, to your point. Yes, we could have made 34 entries and an exemption for the situation. And of any circumstance that we've had in Indy 500 history, this would certainly warrant that 100%. Mm-hmm. However, I believe in tradition. I believe in the fastest 33, et cetera, et cetera. That said, if at any point during the qualifying process your car is deemed illegal, I don't care if you're going for pole or if you're trying to bump your way into the field, I think you should be relegated to a situation where you're going to have to fight for it to get in. And so what I would personally have, the way that I look at it is this. If you had an oversight to send these cars out of technical inspection in the pit lane, we're already starting to set up and let them run their Fast 12 qualifying, then you've already accepted the fact that those cars, even if they're not, you're still going to let them go roll out on track, whether it's, and that's a safety issue. It's a lot of issues. And so you can't tell me, even if you're looking at the facts, this person passed inspection and this car passed inspection, okay, it's human error. Unless these things are videotaped and you can go back and you can look over every inch and fine tooth comb it, there's not really another way to look at it. It's very easily something that was caught on, could be something that was caught on Sunday, but not caught on Saturday. With that is this. I think that you forfeit your chances to fight for pole in that situation. I don't necessarily want to look at it as an LCQ, because the LCQ, like you said, was 4 cars pushing for 3 spots. But I'd say this. When more information came about this morning and we were looking at this, I think you put it on Team Penske and you say, here's what we're doing. One of you guys are going home because we both found you unable to uphold enough of the standard to pass technical inspection, and you've forfeited your opportunity to fight for pole. Your cars were found in violation, so much so that and we don't even know how much of a speed differential or performance that this manipulation to the attenuator actually gives to a car. Mm-hmm. I mean, we don't know if it's, if it reduces drag to the point that you can follow closely, like what Joseph did last year at the Indy 500 on Pato on that last lap, or what you and I, an engineer would know, obviously, but you and I would not. And so I look at this, and to the common fan, I would say, if it's this egregious to throw these kind of penalties at them, then 100% Jacob Abel, I don't give a crap how slow the car is. I genuinely don't. I could literally not give a shit how slow the car is. I look at this and it's legal, and you let them go. And for those that aren't legal, you get them legal and you put it on them. And then Team Penske is going to have to choose. How are we doing this? How are we going to attack? And yeah, it's going to suck. And yeah, you're going to have to eat it. I think that's the process that should have happened. I thought it should have been the 12 versus the 2, mano a mano, to get into the show, because and look, Will Power's not at fault. Joseph Newgarden's not at fault. The team is at fault collectively. And so I think they should have done a special qualifying session this morning to settle it. And that's how you handle the exemption. You uphold the field of 33. You make sure legal cars are in the show, that you're not going to tolerate. I mean, because here's the thing. What are you really penalizing? Cool, they forfeit their spots. How are you not encouraging this to happen again? Because what are you really losing? You're still in the show. You cheated up a car, you got found out, but guess what? You're still in the show. And last I checked, this race pays pretty well. And that's something that, frankly, would have been really good for Miller High Life and Dale Coyne and all involved with Jacob Abel. And they did it the right way, and they got screwed. And let's go a step further with this. How does Honda feel about this? Because you've got a manufacturer that was bumped from the field. In terms of that, 2 Chevys that were caught to be in violation were allowed to stay in this field. And this is in a very important part where we're in the middle of these negotiation cycles of wondering, is Honda staying, is Honda going? I can't imagine that's a good look, and I can't imagine that was fun to look at. And I don't know how you make sense of that either. So there's certain ways that I think I would have preferred to see it handled, and I can understand and I can respect looking at the facts. But if it was an oversight if it was something that they were going to allow on day 2, I can't think that it's nothing that wasn't looked at on day 1 in the same way, because, also when you go to further that light, when you go and you look at Joseph Newgarden's car in the museum and you see the same type of issues from last year's race, and then you hear about this is something that was in testing, this is something that's been consistent at the IMS Oval. Okay, then we're going to find an alternative solution because it's consistent. Whether we overlooked it and made the cars legal, or whether the cars actually were legal on Saturday, but then they weren't on Sunday, whatever the case, there's clearly a trend. And I think, frankly, like, this is where I look at it, and I'm pro Paddock, because, at some point something's got to give. And I can go on and on with this, but this is why you look at that story that you wrote, you look at the conversations that you and I both had inside the paddock with numerous people about independent operations, who should FIA, USAC, who should be doing stuff like this. I think the bottom line is you can't build an independent group and let Penske be the only one paying the bill. I think that's a situation where maybe you look at, okay, all the teams who's in the charter system, everyone's splitting this, everyone's paying a 10th or an 11th or whatever the hell fractions you want to do. I'm not a mathematician, I'm a writer, but you look at this and you're like, and we're going to come up with our own voting, our own independent group, our own independent body of officiating that handles this. And Team Penske will contribute to that. Penske Entertainment will not. And all the other teams will contribute to that appropriately. And I think that's how it needs to be handled, whether that's USAC, the FIA, or some other independent governing body that becomes a creation from scratch that the teams come together to form. But they're just, and I think through that, you can assess different rules like this.
So I want to finish off kind of the where we, where all this ended up today. I've been going back and forth, and I liked your idea about basically forcing one of these, forcing the 2 Team Penske cars to fight for the last spot instead. I mean, that would have been an incredibly extreme way to go about this. I would have been really surprised if it ended up there. I think some of the issues, ultimately the issue that we have, and Doug said it plainly, and we've said it already. By record, we are told that these 2 cars were legal on Saturday, and so it's really tough to take them out of the field when, by the record that we have, unless you can gather enough evidence to prove otherwise, it's hard to take these cars out of the field. Now, I really like your impounding idea, where, like, once you start this qualifying process, now I don't entirely know how this works when you've got another practice session in there in the middle. And I don't know enough exactly about the impound process, to be completely honest, to know how you maintain that overnight. But I think there's that would be a simple solution to this. So, because Doug did mention something today that just once these cars get off the tech pad, that doesn't mean that they are now free to do whatever they want, or if something is found, say when they're on pit lane, they're not going to get penalized for it. The tech pad process is the time in which these cars are looked over with a fine-tooth comb. But ultimately, if Penske Entertainment, IndyCar, the tech inspection crew, Rocket, find something that they don't like or see something going on that they don't like, they can still dole out a penalty, or they can say your car is no longer, up to code and throw you out. I think that's a great way to ensure, certainly moving forward, that if a car is found illegal on Sunday, you can just say straight away, that means this car was illegal on Saturday. I don't know if that's possible. I don't know everything that goes into that, but I know that at least sounds good on paper, because that takes away any of this doubt, uncertainty about who knew what evidence would it take to overrule where things ultimately stood on Saturday, et cetera, et cetera. All right, if your car is deemed to have failed at any point through this process on anything, anything but these parts that you can change to help make the car, things that are able to be tinkered with from a setup process that can make this car go faster or help with the balance in any way. You're not smoothing out an attenuator to help, find some more balance. That's something that you theoretically shouldn't be messing with at all. But if you are found to have messed with this, or if this part is illegal at any point in this process, we are just going to say that this part was illegal the whole time. I think that's one of the fixes that you mentioned that I think was really good. Where I come down, and I know this is going to be unpopular for the purists of this race, and I understand it. Like I understand the traditions around this race. I know that there are sacred parts of this race that you just don't touch. But the evidence that we seem to now have seems to have mounted enough to where it seems pretty clear, and unlikely that these cars were tampered with in this way overnight. And frankly, they should be doing an interview process with every single member of those crews to figure out exactly what happened from a timeline standpoint. How did these cars get this way? Who did it? What is it with? When did it happen? Because these cars didn't just magically come this way. They weren't delivered this way. This happened at some point. Did this happen on Saturday night or Sunday morning? Did this happen this week? Is this something, do you just admit, yes, this is something that we have done before to our cars that didn't get caught? And if it didn't get caught, ultimately, I don't know that you can go, we're not going to go back and take Joseph Newgarden's 500 win away from last year. Let's be very clear on that. I know there are people that are saying Pato Award's the 2024 Indy 500 winner. He's not. This is just like...
That'd be a terrible way to win your first 500.
Pato wouldn't want to win it that way. Neither would Zach Brown. Neither would anyone at Air McLaren. I'm sure they're perfectly fine winning and getting the points from the 2024 St. Pete race that way. They don't want to win the 500 that way. No one does. And so I see this kind of like the Meyer-Shank racing situation at the Rolex 24. And granted, from the way in which I understand that was a very egregious penalty. You'll talk to some people in the paddock. Elio Castroneves, an ex-Team Penske driver, his 2 decades with them and the relationship that he continues to have with Roger from a business standpoint, make of that what you will. But he said, this is just something from an aesthetic standpoint that Team Penske does. It's not like you're gaining 3 miles an hour off of this. Frankly, I don't know that it matters if you're getting 3 miles an hour. If you're getting 1 mile, or if you're getting a tenth of a mile an hour, you very well may be jumping a spot or two in the race. And it's not as much about the qualifying process, but could that give you a tiny little edge in the race to make a difference rather than just qualifying? That's where this ultimately comes down to me too. But so this is a long-winded way, and I'm not doing a very good job of being direct on this, but ultimately I feel like there is enough evidence pointing toward the suggestion that even though your tech folks didn't catch this on Saturday, did not spot anything nefarious. There seems like there's enough evidence out there that this may have taken place in 2024, may have been the case at the open test, may have been the case on days earlier this week. And I don't know that, and I'm sure Penske Entertainment has access to, they have access to the interviews and photos and videos and what have you, as much, if not more, than any reporters have out there. And I'm getting to the point where I feel like I wouldn't take away Will and Joseph's spot in the race, because ultimately they didn't catch this. When the NBA does their last 2-minute report and says, hey, we missed this foul, hey, this person's toe was on the 3-point line, it should have been a 2 instead of a 3, and we count it as a 3. They're not taking away wins. They are looking over things. They're saying what they did right or did wrong and acknowledging it. And in that process, if they dug deep enough and found enough evidence to where they felt like these cars actually were illegal on Saturday, then I think Jacob Abel should have also been in your race, and I think you should have started with 34. I know that opens a massive can of worms. I know that would be completely unsatisfactory to so many people that are passionate about this race, who will be there in attendance, and this race all of a sudden becomes an answer to a Jeopardy question at some point down the road. But I just, you would have to have enough evidence to be able to prove it and say outright, and that is a tough look for this team, and this is also a tough look for this sport to openly admit on one of the biggest days of our season, on 2 of the highest profile cars that the person who owns the series also owns and runs and benefits from when they do well. We missed something. That's a really big thing to admit, and I don't know that Doug and IndyCar would have been able to come to that conclusion overnight. It probably would have taken a little bit more time, and ultimately, it's tough too, because if Jacob Abel is not participating in the practice today, and then you retroactively bump him into the race, into the race field on Wednesday or Thursday, are his crew members still here? You've lost 2 hours of practice time that the rest of the people in the field have got, and you can't get that back. It's just such a tough thing, all of this. I guess what it comes down to, I really feel for Jacob. I feel like there's probably enough evidence out there, if I had to guess, to say that these cars weren't prepared legally on Saturday, if I had to make a guess. And this is a really tough situation to make a decision on.
But can we agree on this, though? There's literally a rule that, to paraphrase this rule, 9.2.1 or something like that is the rule. Don't screw with the attenuator. Don't touch it.
So the 9.2.1 is the ways in which the things that the penalties that IndyCar can dole out. Doug referenced that in his press conference, and that was it's kind of always been this weird thing with IndyCar over the last couple of years. They have these rules, but they're also really vague, and they can essentially do what they want. It's how we got the finish to the 2023 Indy 500. In the end, there's a rule book that lays out lots of things, but
and then the very last one is, but we can reserve the right to do whatever we want.
Yeah, and so that's what Doug essentially said. He said that's how we got to these cars starting 32nd and 33rd, because by the rule book, these cars qualified 11th and 12th. They, on Saturday, were deemed to be legal, and they not only made the top 30 that guaranteed them spots, but they qualified to be one of the 12 fastest cars, which would mean that you at minimum would start 12th. And so he said he believed that it was not right for a car to be penalized and start 12th when, if they had run theoretically, maybe they end up 12th anyways, even if they put forth an honest effort in a run that is just 12th fastest in that group. And so that is why they felt like they needed to take things a step earlier, which then opens that can of worms of showing you can take things a step further to do ultimately what you want to do. And Doug was still then at the same time very resolute in feeling like, no, but they qualified on Saturday and they were legal. This field is only 33 cars, has always been, has almost always been, has not always been, should always be. And it comes down to basically saying, we want to bend this rule. We think it's right and proper to bend this rule, but we're not going to bend this other one. And that becomes more of a judgment call.
It's just, in my opinion, it's crap. If you were caught tampering and you broke the rules, then frankly, you're the team that's not supposed to be. Like, I think that's the other thing that's kind of crazy to me is when you think about the fact that when Roger Penske bought IndyCar, Indianapolis Motor Speedway, IMS Productions, the whole shooting match, right? Since he bought that ahead of the 2020 season, and you look at some of what's gone on in the sport, and you look at some of the penalties that have happened in the sport, but you also look at what the infractions were in the sport. And I think that's the bigger key is like the actual infractions. There is literally not another team, Andretti, Global, Chip Ganassi Racing, anybody. And maybe they're operating in gray areas that we haven't found out yet. And maybe there's certain things and loopholes they're finding that they're doing exceptionally well that Team Penske's not. We don't know. But since we're going to go to the facts being the facts, here's the fact. Since Roger Penske has bought this series, they have the worst record when it comes to what it is being penalized. Like when you think back to last year's push to pass scandal and you think this right now in this moment, what's happening. And it's, the other thing, it's St. Pete, Joseph Newgarden forfeits a Win to Pato award. Ironic that he could probably forfeit an Indy 500 Win to Pato award if we really did some deep diving. And Pato inherits two extra wins as a result of Penske's shenanigans. But this isn't something that's overlooked because it's St. Pete and we announced this presser at Barber Motorsports Park. This is the race. This is the biggest race in the world. This is where you're potentially going to get 6 million television viewers on race day, 400,000 packing in a 2.5 mile oval. This is the Super Bowl for all of us. This is the biggest place. And to go into that with something like this, no other team has come close to touching the penalties. No one's come close to touching the infractions with tampering with coating, with now manipulating an attenuator. And I appreciate if you're not cheating, you're not trying. I don't know if that says that a lot of people aren't trying, but maybe they're just also smart enough to know, hey, this is just the area we don't go. And if you're smart enough to not go into those areas, then you shouldn't be penalized for it. And right now, in my opinion, Dale Coyne Racing and Jacob Abel have been penalized by not being allowed to be in the race, despite the fact that they did everything the right way. And that's why I look at this and I say, I don't give a damn about Saturday. You did everything wrong on Sunday, and you proved it. Like it was proven tenfold that you were illegal. So it should have been settled accordingly, in my opinion. And I know this is probably going to piss off a lot of people, but I honestly don't think the penalty was enough because I don't even see it as a penalty, really. Like, yeah, cool, you forfeit 1 or 2 points, like for that, and maybe that matters, but does it really matter when Alex Palou is going to probably lock this championship up by mid-Ohio? No. Does it? Did you make the race and what ways can this play out on Sunday? Who knows? And here's the sad part of it. And I know we can't stay on the Penske stuff forever. So it's probably, I don't know if this is a good pivot point or if you have one last point though, is the sad part about this is this. Prema Racing and rookie team Prema Racing, rookie IndyCar team Prema Racing, and rookie Robert Shwartzman, Israeli born, Russia raised, hadn't been on an oval in his entire life outside of the IndyCar test and probably some other small tests prior to
Nashville. Yeah.
Nashville, goes out there and throws the gauntlet at the field. Robert Gue, credit to him and his technical abilities to effectively make sure Michael Cannon's 2-week presence at the team didn't matter, to go out there and put a rocket ship together. All of this crap, and that's exactly what it is. It's crap.
And an engineer on the car who's working full-time, I think it's SpaceX, who's doing this like on vacation, I think some people have said, who was a Team Penske engineer. I'm probably going to mispronounce his last name. Eric Lytle, I think is how you pronounce it.
He's familiar around the IndyCar ranks back in the day with the and sports car ranks with the Chevy bits too.
That's right. He had been Joseph Newgarden's race engineer for 1 year in 2022. He was the person that replaced Gavin Ward, who had been on Joseph's car for, I'd say, maybe 3 or 4 years at least. When Gavin took his 6-month gardening leave and then eventually ended up at Aaron McLaren and went through his saga that we know he went through there. Eric was the one who was hired to be on Joseph's car in 2022. Was the third consecutive year in which Joseph finished runner-up in the championship. I don't know exactly the circumstances that led to Eric being dropped or parting ways with Team Penske, but ultimately they hire Luke Mason for that job, and Luke is now in his third season with Joseph.
Yeah, and so let's think about this real quick, because frankly, this is the part where I'm a little passionate, to be blunt, is all of this crap that involves Team Penske and their violations has, in my opinion, put a black cloud over everything that was good about yesterday. You had your first, in my opinion, or in my recollection, the first Israeli-born driver qualify for the Indy 500, not just qualify for the Indy 500, but put it on pole. First rookie since Teo Fabi in 1983. A rookie team, that hadn't happened in, good Lord, who knows how long. And then Takuma Sato trashed his primary car a month ago. That team thrashed on a backup car. We all know RLL, Ray Hall Letterman Lanigan's woes in qualifying the last few years. He goes out there and almost gets pole a day after Graham Rahal almost got bumped into the last chance qualifier. And then, oh, by the way, Pato O'Ward, your runner-up, your sports most popular driver.
Who's never been on the front row before.
First Mexican on the front row, if I recall. You've got such an eclectic group of storylines on the front row alone that should all be celebrated. And instead of celebrating them, we're talking about a team that, frankly, didn't get it together and screwed up. And we're highlighting them more than we're celebrating what an amazing qualifying bout it really was yesterday. And then, you know what? In some ways, I think it was probably unique because there wasn't a Penske person battling for it. There wasn't a Ganassi on the front. This was one of those weird qualifying bouts where it was like just complete and unique change that we don't get very often, because Ganassi are extremely good. Team Penske are extremely good. So it was neat to have something different, a little bit of variety to add to the spice of life. But we're not celebrating that, unfortunately. Like,
when was the last? So I guess the last non-Penske or Ganassi pole sitter at the 500 was probably Marco Andretti in 2020. Does that sound right? Because it was Dixon in 21 and 22 and Palou in 23.
And if I have my memory correct, it's the first time since 2015 that neither team was on the front row, but I might have my year wrong by 1 or 2.
Probably. I want to do one more thing before we completely close out this the everything related to the Team Penske stuff. So we've talked about what's taken place, the timeline, how we got here. We've gone through some thoughts on what took place and what should have changed, or what should have been done differently, or what we feel like we know. I want to come up with some ideas, or get your thoughts on what either needs to change or what is going to change moving forward in the wake of this. So we've got we've referenced a couple times, there is this brewing conflict of interest concern in this paddock. As you mentioned, I wrote about it in April coming out of the Long Beach weekend, reporting that IndyCar was involved in some level of discussions about the creation of some sort of independent body to influence the sport, whether it was someone or a group that would be taking control of the tech inspection process, so that was wholly separate from IndyCar, Penske Entertainment, and ultimately Penske Corp and Roger Penske, or an entire governing body where you might have kind of a situation where, kind of like Formula One, for example, where you have the FIA that owns the racing part of this, and that they are in charge of the governing of the sport. And then you also have the commercial rights holder in Liberty Media. So Liberty Media is the one that is, I'm sure the FIA is making some money off of this. I don't exactly know how that all works, but Liberty Media is the group that is ultimately, pulling in the revenue, signing the commercial sponsorship deals, promoting some of the races, collecting the promoter fees, doling out money to the teams, et cetera, et cetera. So they are kind of the financial arm, the commercial arm, the media arm of this, the front-facing part of all of this. And so that's probably as extreme as you could go at some point. So I wrote about that in April from hearing from a very credible source that this was part of the many-pronged discussions around IndyCar's future from a technical standpoint, from a what is this new car going to look like standpoint, from a who are our manufacturers going to be in the future standpoint. Some ongoing negotiations there, certainly not only with Chevy and with Honda, but with prospective manufacturers. And so in the process of trying to make this roadmap, I was told that there are some level of discussions on some would say a need, others would say whether in which this takes place or not, the creation of some sort of third rail that is completely separate and outside of the umbrella of Penske Entertainment and IndyCar. And a lot of these concerns have stemmed from Push to Pass last year, where there were questions about the investigation process. There were questions in, whether these penalties were strict enough, about who knew what, when, how these mistakes came to be about, how they were not noticed for so long, whether they were not noticed or not, et cetera, et cetera. And it came down to where I feel like most people landed is, I don't know that there's anyone in the paddock that thinks that Roger Penske is sitting in a smoke-filled room and calling in favors to race control or to Rocket or to anyone to try and get things skirted past that shouldn't be. And I don't even know, this would be less nefarious from Roger's standpoint, but I don't know that there is anyone in this process that is doing favors without, say Roger knowing about it, because they feel like they owe Roger something, or they want to outwardly favor him over the rest of the field. I just don't know. I don't have a sense that anything that deep and nefarious is happening, but it comes down to being a perception issue.
Mm-hmm.
That's the way it's been phrased to me, where you have a manufacturer like Honda, who is has been competing against Chevy for so long. Who makes engines for Chevy? Ilmor. Who owns Ilmor? Roger Penske. Who owns the series? Roger Penske. Who owns the track where the biggest race of the year is run? Roger Penske. Who promotes that race? Roger Penske. Who promotes half of the races on the schedule, either Roger Penske or people who work for Roger Penske. And so you get to this area where when something like this happens with his team that Roger Penske owns and has owned for decades, these questions are going to continue to come up on who knew what when. Were these penalties just? Were they fair? Were they is this could they have done more? They skirted some of the rules on not from saying that Joseph and Power should start 11th and 12th to 32nd and 33rd. Well, if you stretch that rule, why didn't you stretch another one? And we just get into this never-ending cycle of were things done properly? And you wouldn't have that if some other folks own some of these things. Now, I'm not saying Roger needs to go sell his team, and I'm not saying that Roger needs to go sell the series, but that seems like the easiest way to ensure that some of these things don't continue happening. Because, frankly, we probably see a lot fewer penalties and inspection issues in IndyCar than I feel like we see and hear about in NASCAR and Formula One. I don't know why that is. I still think there are plenty of people that are pushing the issue a lot in this sport. You hear a lot of really interesting rumors on what team is doing what and how they're finding this advantage here and there. But it's going to happen again because Team Penske is one of the best in the sport, and they're going to continue to push the issue just like everyone else, just like I'm sure Chip Ganassi Racing is, and Andretti Global is, and RLL and what have you. And so this is just going to continue to be a perception issue until it is fixed. And so I don't know where this is going to end up. I know Doug was very adamant that he believes that the tech inspection process worked as it was supposed to on Sunday. I still think there are some very glaring questions as to whether it worked as it should have on Saturday or other times in the past. That's the first thing that I think needs to come from this ultimately. And I from talking to some people in this paddock, I think there are going to be tentacles from what took place on Sunday and what was announced and took place today that are going to continue to reverberate. This is not going to be the last time that we are talking about this, because I think ultimately something like this is going to change, or there are going to be other things that happen or are said if things don't change.
Yeah. So I think that there's a collective high number of people that are involved in this paddock that were also involved in this paddock 30 years ago when things were hitting a significant point into the sport. And I think we've got to be careful just not to repeat history with one thing being watching over everything, because we know what the fallout could be. People get tired of it, manufacturers, teams, etc., and they find ways to do other things in their best interest. And what I would say is this, and it's not about, again, this is, I think selling a series or selling the speedway or something like that, while it's possible, I also don't think that it's one, realistic. Two, I also think it's the easy way out. I think the simple solution is the one that's the one that I suggested earlier, the one that you touched on. I think what would fix 95%, not even kidding, 95%. The other 5% is about communication between the series and the teams about innovations like the new car and technology and stuff like that. I think that is a huge thing. You don't get
you're always going to have people too that as long as Roger owns the series and IMS and Team Penske, you're going to have people that are never going to be happy with that.
Oh, yeah, no.
And the thing to tell those people is Tony George was the exact same way. Tony George's team at Carpenter Racing was not nearly as successful as Roger Penske's is. But when it comes down to it, the last two owners of this track, or the people operating it, were in the same position. They owned own the track, they own the series, they own the team. It's just that Tony George's is not nearly as successful and influential in the news. And it was frankly not a time in the sport where so much was changing and going on at the same time too. But if you really want to point fingers and parse out the absolute specifics of all of this, this is technically not something new that just started happening in the 2020 season.
Yeah. And so, well, obviously there needs to be better communication about forward thinking of the sport, because why the hell did you have all the teams sign all these charter agreements if you know you're going to turn around and not have good open dialogue and communication about certain things, or build councils to help move the sport forward? That's a whole other separate damn topic. But this one in particular, what would fix 95% of the issues is having a third party that is effectively the teams collectively pay for, all evenly distributed, and you let them officiate, whether it's just the technical stuff, whether it's technical stuff, pit road, similar to an FIA. Maybe it is the FIA, maybe it's USAC like it was a long time ago before that fallout at Texas Motor Speedway in 97, or maybe it's a complete third party creation that the teams source themselves and vote on, et cetera, like I said earlier. But I feel like that would fix 95% of the issues, because the only thing that is a question right now, the only thing that's become questionable is the integrity of the situation. And the way you fix that is by effectively just taking yourself out of it completely. And that one thing, I think, would solve so many things and so many problems for the paddock.
Yeah, you've got to give these team owners a voice, because right now, I mean, as I'm trying to report all of this out, you've got several team owners, and now I know not all of them. Zach Brown gave some interesting quotes to Jenna Fryer of the Associated Press in a story that published not long before we started taping. Chip Ganassi, ironically enough, was scheduled to be on Kevin Harvick's Kevin Harvick Happy Hour podcast for today, and that was held, and that taping still happened. And Chip, of course, was asked about the news of the day, which makes perfect sense. So we have a couple of team owners, frankly, the two biggest outside of Roger, and the most vocal, most prominent, most popular, have given some thoughts. But there are a lot of people in this paddock that will tell you what they think about this privately, but they don't want to say anything publicly because they don't want to rock the boat, because getting Roger Penske and Penske Corp and Penske Entertainment pissed off at you, now, while nothing may happen officially, like you basically, you don't want to get on Roger Penske's bad side. You don't want to go all Michael Andretti, St. Pete 2024, and say what you really think about what Roger's doing with his leadership of the sport, and then essentially get iced out of any meeting to where Dan Taurus is the one that they're going to ask questions and to get input on things instead of Michael, which is kind of what I understand took place after all of that went down close to 18 months ago there. So there are lots of people. You know, I had one team owner when I was asking for insight or thoughts, just on background to kind of get a sense of where the paddock was immediately after all this went down. And one of them said they think that the paddock has a lot of work to do on how all these processes go and where they get to these points, but didn't want to say it publicly, didn't want to have his name attached to it, because he wanted to keep these discussions between him and Roger, part of which I think is smart. There are some things that you don't just need to go and air your dirty laundry out. I understand that our role as journalists in all of this is trying to bring light to what is happening behind closed doors. Ultimately, we are not, we're not here to be PR machines for the series. We're here to report on what's really happening. I know that Jenna, for example, was able to report that there was a team owner meeting today where they were kind of told how all this took place, what the infractions were, what the penalties were, and allowed to give some input. And there was, some discussion, ultimately, I think, from some other team owners about whether team owners should be quiet about this, move on, not say anything to any media that reach out, or whether they should give some statements. And there was some pushback there. Some folks thought that people should stay quiet and keep this in-house. Some thought that they wanted the freedom to go and say their thoughts. And there's these last couple of years, especially, there have been a lot of folks in high places at teams in this paddock that are really feel like they're walking on eggshells because you say something wrong, you accuse Roger or anyone in the Penske Corp, Penske Entertainment world of doing something wrong, and it just doesn't go well for you because ultimately they're the ones making decisions. And if you accuse them of wrongdoing or of not doing something to the best of their abilities, they're just more than likely oftentimes not going to ask for your opinion. Ultimately, things like Roger, although maybe not even as much so, I still think a good amount, though, Roger is making decisions on all of this. This is not in lots of things, minus the penalties of today, Roger ultimately is the decision maker, and that's probably how it should be. He's the one who owns all these companies, so I'm not saying that there should be some sort of a board that's collectively making decisions, but ultimately Roger's going to do what he thinks is the best thing to do for this sport. So, there are some people that think if you're not a yes man to Roger, that your life gets pretty uncomfortable in high roles in this organization. But so what I'm getting at is speaking out is tough. And so I think if you had some sort of a group where or a setup where these team owners had some more influence, that would take some control away from Roger as in stewarding the direction of this sport. But I think that would be something that team owners, I'm sure, would welcome, because at this point, their only influence is speaking privately and trying to convince Roger or the powers that be around him the way in which they should do something better or an improvement that they can make. I'm not saying that they're completely unwilling to change or completely unreceptive to outside voices, but I just know that those can be some tough conversations at sometimes. And ultimately, I think sometimes the least productive thing you can do is speak out publicly, but sometimes there are owners that feel like they or stakeholders, for example, like Honda a couple of years ago, who spoke out about their concerns and the direction of the sport and the cost effectiveness of participating in it. Sometimes they feel like the only way to really get something done is public pressure. There are some folks in the paddock that would say, and maybe have some differing stories on whether or not that eventually ever is effective, but I think that's something that would be better for the sport in the long run, is for folks to have actual influence on the way this sport is governed and the direction in which it takes, rather than feeling like they just have to try to find some way to influence the way decisions are made.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't think I could have said any better myself on that one. I think that it's funny because to that end, and again, not to get too deep in the weeds on it, because we're pretty deep in the weeds on this podcast, but and thank y'all for staying with us that have tuned in. It's just there's plenty of people, high-ranking officials of different teams in the sport that can, including owners, that literally will pull us to the side and talk to us privately about certain things, and in some cases anonymously, for different stories, because they feel like the messaging needs to get out there, and it's because they're walking on eggshells. It's because they feel that way, and I probably felt that a little bit more 2 years ago. For sure. Definitely last year, shortly around the Penske push to pass scandal. I think now everyone is just fed up at this point, because you're starting to see like drivers are vocalizing their frustrations with this latest situation. They're calling it Graham Rahal today on
one of the local TV stations here.
Yeah. And said it's a trend, and he's 100% right. And, Pato saying what he said, and we're getting to a point that, like, even if the owners don't say anything, I mean, that's fine. Most people who are fans. Most casuals don't even know how to recognize the owners, but you're going to recognize a dude in a fire suit carrying a helmet when he steps out of the car, and when he or she speaks their mind. You're going to take notice of that, and in some ways, that reverberates more than anything owners could say, because there's a hell of a lot more optics on that. So, but yeah, so that's all I've got to say on that.
So we think there's we'd like to see some changes in maybe like the day-to-day process and how qualifying works, maybe with some sort of an impound process. I think it would be productive in the long run to fix this conflict of interest issue that we have on Penske's hands, to change the way in which this sport is governed in some way. What ultimately do you feel like is the fallout of this at Team Penske? Because I just have a feeling that Roger was the one that laid down those suspensions a year ago for push to pass, when he told Luke Mason and Tim Cindric and Ron Rzuski, and there's another name, Robbie Atkinson was the other engineer. All four of them were suspended for the entire month of May, and that came from Roger himself. That was a decision he made on behalf of his team, not a decision that the series made. So this wasn't something that, say Jay Fry made as the president of IndyCar last year, that was then communicated and handed down by IndyCar in the way in which Doug Bowles and IndyCar made that decision today. I just feel like knowing what this has brought on, the perception issues that this causes, not just from a what are they getting by with, what has really happened, have other cars been legal or not in other races in the past. I wonder if we're going to end up with a true fall guy here at some point, because Roger just decides that you can fool me once, shame on you, but fool me twice, shame on me. And he's just not going to put up with someone skirting the line so closely, and frankly just not recognizing where you can and can't push the limits. This was a cut and dry rule. This is a spec part that you cannot adjust. And frankly, it seems like maybe this is something that should have been caught a while ago. And so when it wasn't getting caught, it wasn't getting caught. There was certainly this feeling that, if we've been getting by with this, maybe we can and are allowed to change this part in this way. But I'm guessing, he kind of said some of this publicly last year in his public comments to some of us after the fact. I have to think that after all of this took place, Roger Penske told Tim Cindric and the people on this team, do not put me in this situation again. I cannot afford this team to be pushing the limits on things recklessly, without there being a gray area where you truly feel like there is some legitimate points to be made that we are allowed to be doing what we're doing. I cannot have you making mistakes that are cut and dry, easy to diagnose mistakes. And this is one of those. And last year's, you can talk to different people who think different things, whether this was a simple mistake in a code that was left in the car unbeknownst to anyone, and it was only found during the warm-up at Long Beach because of the technical issues that IndyCar was having on what was working and what wasn't working in the cars. You'll have some people that believe that. You'll have some people that believe that they were outright cheating and doing this until they got caught and willing to suffer the consequences. I don't ultimately know. Very few, if any, people do know the answer to that question. But what we know on this is a cut and dry rule that has been in place for a long time. So whether this mistake was made a year or two ago and ultimately was only caught now by IndyCar, or whether this was made a week ago in preparation for this race, thinking that this was something that they could and wanted to do to give themselves just a tiny little extra edge, whether this was something that they thought they needed to do for a look of the car standpoint, and just frankly made the mistake of changing and tampering with something that can't be tampered with and changed on the car, or whether this is something that someone did overnight on Saturday, which I highly doubt, but is potential to be true. This team, I am very confident in, was told, do not do things that could be taken as illegal or wrong. Do not put me in this position, because this was already a firestorm a year ago, and clearly someone or someone's didn't get that message. And I just have the feeling, as much as I'm sure Roger Penske doesn't want to do this, I just have the feeling that someone is going to end up having to take the fall for this, because having it happen one time was problem enough, but I don't know that this is something that we're going to walk away from without some massive changes being made from a series standpoint. And so I just get the feeling that, I don't know if it's someone getting fired. I don't know if it's someone stepping down. Again, some of that depends on verbiage, and someone is probably unlikely to step away on their own accord truly. I guess maybe what I'm getting at is Tim Cindric still in charge of this team next month when we get to Detroit?
Yeah. I because you're not going to do a change like that in the middle of the season. I think it would be a finish out the year, because you've only got 3 months left, and you're not going to want to. You also don't want to create that going into a race you own in the Detroit Grand Prix, which is very big. You don't want to have that kind of attention. So I don't necessarily think there's going to be a change like that in Detroit. It makes you wonder who the fall guy would be, if there is a fall guy. I will say this, though.
It could be the type of thing where whether you learn this or you say that this was the case, whether it was accurate and truthful or not, you wonder if this is the case where you say this person did this person went rogue, or these couple people did this and they should have known that you can't do this, and ultimately we're going to take the fall for it. I don't know if this is like a low to mid-level person that we will find out is the person or people that made these decisions and they get fired because Roger Penske told the team, as I'm kind of insinuating, a year ago, we cannot afford something like this again. I could see both. And you're right. I'm guessing. I can't imagine that Roger takes someone completely out of the picture who's
not saying it's not possible, though.
Yeah.
I just don't see it as conceivable personally.
It probably depends on how fast Roger feels like he needs to act on something like this. If he feels like he has to, in order to make this go away and remedy it, whether he needs to make a massive change and a massive swing and really put his foot down, whether this is enough and they can weather it and get to the end of the season. If they had some sort of a situation where Tim Cindric were to step down, we all know, he told me after his decision became public that he had stepped down from, and again, he said that this was a decision he made on his own accord and told Roger about. There are some people who believe that he was directed to and told that this would be happening. Again, I only know what I've been told by Tim publicly.
This is what I would say, though, to finish that one thought is, let's just. No, I don't wish this upon anybody. I never want to see people lose their jobs. But I will say this, is that a lot of the same people who made offenses last year are involved in this offense this year. And a lot of very familiar names to a lot of fans and a lot of people in the paddock. But I would say this too. If any of those officials, whether or high-ranking people with Penske, Team Penske, whether it's Tim Cindric, Rzucki, whomever, you throw one of those guys out of your team and they're a free agent, and look, they're still pretty damn good at what they do. They're exceptionally good. Can you imagine a situation where they get swept up by an Andretti or a Ganassi, and then it's not just the fact that, your team was screwed to a degree and with this situation if you're Penske, but then you got to fight them, and they know that person knows how your processes are and how your build is and what that could do to transpire things. So it's a really thin tightrope to a really big problem. And I don't know what the solution is. I don't know if there is a correct solution, to be honest, because I think no matter what, you're paying the price. And
it comes down to, I think the best way to compare it is kind of like when we see penalties in college sports, whether like the easiest one to compare to is like a recruiting violation. When you see a team or a program start to have multiple violations, you have to diagnose, if you're, say, the athletic director or the president of the university, is this a rogue individual or a couple rogue individuals who did something when they were told they shouldn't have done it, and it's just unfortunate that the leader of the program didn't know? Or is this a lack of institutional control? That's the phrase that we hear a lot in college sports when you end up with a head coach that gets suspended, not because of things that they did personally, but because enough things were done under their watch that were a problem by other people that they were in charge of. You can see someone either fired or suspended for a lack of institutional control. And that's what Roger, if he decides to make some sort of a change. And again, I don't think the Paddock is going to be okay, both from a team standpoint and from a series standpoint, with only these grid penalties and fines that end up not really being fines, and small points penalties and lack of pit selection and team personnel suspensions for what ends up being 7 days. I don't know that the Paddock is going to be happy until something additional is done on both ends. And if you're Roger, you have to decide and get to the bottom of, is this something that came from the top down? Is this something where Tim or Ron or someone else was telling people that they need to be pushing the limit and finding this extra tenth of a mile an hour or half a tenth of a mile an hour, and they felt like they needed to do this? Were people not properly educated on the rule book? I don't know. I'm just saying, I think there's more coming to this. I think we're going to be talking about this beyond the next couple days, whether we learn about it in a week, whether we learn about it at the end of the season if Tim steps down. I don't know. But the way to put a bow on that is, I think there's going to be more to this, and I'm going to be really interested to see how it's handled.
100%, and couldn't agree more. I do think changes will be coming, but again, I think it'll be once the season plays out. But hey, we've been wrong before.
That's right.
But to move on, just for the next bit, just briefly, is I think we need to touch on the belle of the ball, and that's Robert Shwartzman and what he was able to accomplish. The phenomenal effort, the fact that fourth time ever on an oval, really, if you think about it, fourth week, like if you think about Nashville test and then maybe the oval test at IMS, and then maybe you can include the test days if you want, so you could say this is his 10th time ever on an oval. Regardless, it takes some kind of bravery to go into a corner, trust, you're supposed to trust your ass, as they say, trust your rear end, and know what the car is going to tell you. But when you're so new to this, how do you know what to trust? And the fact that he just sent it, literally the phrase, just send it, he did it. And, I don't want to say that it was totally stunning after we saw his pace on Saturday, but knowing that organization struggled to just even get laps in on the first day that they were unloading, and all of us were like, oh, they look like they're going to be the first team that's going to make on bump day. It's going to be Ilott or Shwartzman fighting for the 33rd spot. They look like they're all out of sorts. Man, was everybody wrong. And based on Saturday, you knew they'd have something to play with on Sunday, but you didn't really know that they were the pole contender. You thought maybe they'd flirt with the fast six at sixth, or maybe they'd end up settling in eighth. It was electrifying. And also the crowd response was wonderful too, and appreciative of seeing, a fresh face do something. I mean, that's what this race is about. That's what makes it so special and so captivating. And to be the first rookie on pole since Teo, to win pole, I should say, since Teo Fabi. Tony Stewart obviously leading the field to green as a rookie in '96 after the unfortunate untimely death of Scott Brayton in the post-qualifying crash. But the fact is, this was a sensational effort all around. And we touched on the front row a minute ago with Takuma Sato and his trials, and then Pato. I think this is setting up for a very unique and unpredictable Indy 500. But for the moment, now that the black cloud has been lifted after an hour and change of talking about Penske, I think definitely we got to celebrate this guy.
Yeah, it's the thing. I think the thing that surprised me more than anything, outside of the fact that this team had a car that could qualify on pole. I've said it here and I've written it other places. Like, there was a class of probably 6 drivers that I thought needed to be on watch mode that could get bumped, and it was the 2 drivers from Dale Coyne Racing, the 2 drivers from Prema, and the 2 drivers that weren't Graham Rahal at Rahal Letterman Lanigan Racing. And you probably could have said all 3, so that would amount to 7. I wanted to give Graham the benefit of the doubt. Ultimately, he is the slowest qualifying car from that team again this year. But there was reason for that. This is, you watch those, the margins that we're working with here, especially in the middle of the pack. I remember, I think I wrote somewhere, I guess it was after Saturday coming into Sunday, 4th through 12th was separated by 1.01 miles an hour for a 4-lap average. So, like, you had these 3 drivers at the top, Alex Palou, Scott McLaughlin, and Joseph Newgarden, that looked at the time they were the class of the field. But then you have such a small margin separating 4th from essentially like potentially the driver that would start on the inside of the second row to the guy who wouldn't even be in the fast 12. He had like a little bit more than a mile an hour. You had these, like, I think it was 0.003 of a mile an hour difference between Marco Andretti and Graham Rahal on who was going to finish on Saturday 30th and who was going to not be guaranteed a spot and have to go work one more day to get in the field. Like, we're talking such small margins here. And yes, this team had employees on it that had been in IndyCar and had worked on successful teams before, had done oval racing, had been part of the Indy 500, but it's such a different beast to when you think about the number of employees that they did have that had never been here before. The fact that you're just coming here for the first time and you're still working at the kinks in your just kind of your day-to-day process and how you go about making changes and communicating setups. People are still trying to probably speak the same language, and this is the first time some of these folks are experiencing this. This is a team that didn't move into their shop until December of this year. They didn't announce the signing of Robert Shwartzman until November. They were still getting parts like and still I don't think quite had everything that they wanted after their initial test on track on January, I think maybe 31st, the Thermal Club. Like, it was a massive accomplishment that they were just on track in January, at the end of January. And it was, when you looked at it, an incredible feat that they were running at St. Pete and not dead last. Now, yes, they were having some issues here and there the first couple of races that they were needing to work out, but it was really impressive, that this team had a car that was capable of doing this. I was also really surprised. If you would have told me Prema is even going to have one driver in the Fast 12, I would have said Callum Ilott every single time. Now, he hasn't qualified up there. He's only been in this race, 3 times. Not always had the most success. He was with a Juncos Hauling, a racing team, in 21 and or no, am I saying this right? 22 and 23. Mm-hmm. that hadn't been in this race for several years, who was new to the aero screen, et cetera, kind of, not as new and fresh to the Indy 500 and IndyCar as Prema, but kind of along that same wavelength. But he had a chance to work with Aaron McLaren last year. We've seen at times when he has a good car that Callum could have a lot of speed. So I was really surprised that the Prema driver, even in the Fast 12, wasn't Callum. But this makes me really excited to see what Robert has for ovals the rest of the year. It's not like we don't have any other ovals. These ovals are going to be very different. So I don't know if whatever it is in his driving style and his skill set is just really great for these, a super speedway like this that maybe doesn't translate over to, the next oval race that we have on the calendar, Worldwide Technology Raceway, in a couple weeks. But this is just such an interesting wrinkle that no one was expecting going into this weekend. And now you've got a driver up there that you have to at least think about for this race. This is, I think, getting pole is one thing. I think winning this race is an entirely different process and takes an entirely different skill set, not only from the driver, but the team and the car. There's a reason that we ask drivers, how's your qualifying car? How's your race car? Because they can often elicit very different answers. I still don't think that I would probably consider Robert even in my top 10 of favorites that I think can or would win this race, but he's probably not too far beyond that. And that's an incredible accomplishment in its own, because if you would have been asking me 10 days ago and you said, who's the most likely person, or, how likely do you think it is that the drivers in the field win this race? Robert's probably outside my top 30. So it's a really cool thing. I was admittedly writing through a lot of his time in the spotlight and his press conference last night dealing with other things. So I feel like I wish I had a better handle on exactly how all this happened. And I wish I would have been able to have some more conversations with members of this team to get a better sense of telling the story. But I'm glad we touched on it, because it's something to celebrate. We don't see underdog stories like this in the sport very often. We see them more than in other, we see this more than in, say, F1. You're not going to have a Racing Bulls driver go and take pole at Monaco next weekend. That's not, there's as less or as unlikely as it would be that Prema would take pole at the Indy 500. I think it's even less likely that Gabriel Bortoleto from Sauber is going to be on pole for Monaco. That stuff doesn't happen. So it's cool that we still see some underdogs, some Cinderella stories like this in the sport. So often, especially lately, we are seeing Aaron McLaren, Andretti Global, Ganassi, or Penske winning races and taking poles. So anytime you have anyone outside that, like a Christian Lundgaard win at Toronto, I know was such a cool thing, because we just didn't see that often. And this is even rarer and an even bigger deal, and I'm excited to see what he can do in the race on Sunday.
Yeah, and I'm equally excited about the person starting alongside, well, both people really, in Sato and Pato. But Takuma Sato in a one-off in a backup car, P2, best qualifying result he's ever had at the Indy 500 for the two-time winner, and both times he's won this race. Let me rephrase it this way: the only time that he is every time he's qualified fourth or better. That's how I want to say it, which has only been twice. Both times he ended up winning it.
Mm-hmm.
And the start of this race is what's got me really intrigued, because you've got a guy who's never led the field to green in an IndyCar race, let alone led the field to green on an oval in an IndyCar race, let alone do it on a three-wide, formation lap. And then you got a guy in Takuma. We all know his mantra, but usually he's pretty calculated on starts because he's very methodical with letting the race come to him. But the reality is it's a one-off. He hasn't been in an IndyCar on a regular race weekend basis to get a feel for the sensations of this. He's still a veteran. He should still be fine. And then you got Pato, incredibly aggressive. We know what he wants. He wants to win this race more than anything in the world on the outside of this. I'm really fascinated with how the start of this race goes going into turn one and how they navigate that. And Maybe it's something we see them practice on Friday. I highly doubt it, but it's certainly, you would think that maybe there's an opportunity to discuss it, because with Scott Dixon right there behind, with Alex Palou right there behind, and a few others, I would imagine that everyone's going to coach up the rookie to make sure that it could be as organized as possible, because, you can't win it on the first lap, but you can damn sure lose it.
Yeah. I want to hold off our talk on what we expect to see in this race for another episode that we'll tape here later this week. So we'll maybe kind of leave things there so we have a lot more to talk about when it comes to what we expect to see in Sunday's race, who we think's going to win, who we think can win. We can do some fun stuff here in a couple days. But this was a great spirited discussion. Again, for those of you who are still listening, it was cool. Like, Joey and I didn't talk about what we were going to say, our topics, and that's probably why it felt maybe a little unorganized at times, kind of rambling and jumping around from different things. But I thought this was a really great way just to kind of break down such a big hot button topic, and something that needed to get a lot of depth and perspective and some back and forths and some just genuine conversation. That's what we ultimately want this podcast to be, is two people who know a lot about the sport, who cover it from a day-to-day basis, who are embedded, who have great sourcing, just talk about what is going on in the IndyCar series, because that's ultimately, I don't think that there is enough of that in the podcast world. You get a lot of people who are one person and are bringing on guests, and I still think that there's a great time and way to do that. Or you've got maybe two people that just are in a different kind of in different lanes in this sport. If you're a driver, you've got a different perspective on things than we do, and I like to think that we have balanced, well-rounded perspectives, because our jobs kind of enforce us to be that way. And so that's why I was really excited to have this discussion tonight, to break down everything that we think, that we know, that we don't know on this. And again, as we both mentioned, I think there will be more to come on it. But excited to be able to talk, hopefully, in a couple of days here, just about the Indy 500, and actually get down to thinking about the idea of crowning someone for this biggest race in the world, because it's always, no matter who it is and no matter how it comes about, it's always an incredible story. And there's going to be some great action in store for us here coming on Sunday afternoon.
Yeah, no, for sure. Excited. We're almost there, man. We're almost there.
All right. Tune in again later on this week for another edition of the Inside Line. We'll, again, break down the whole field, talk about who we think can win, talk about what it's going to take for some folks to win, talk about what this hybrid is going to be like and how it's going to impact this race, and ultimately what we expect to see in the greatest spectacle in racing for the 109th running. Thanks again for everyone who tuned in, for stayed with us on this bit of a lengthy episode, but we hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you come back for the next edition a couple of days from now of the Inside Line.